Brendan. Thanks everyone for coming out. The Hamilton Coalition Stop the War for organizing this. Unfortunately, this was sort of partly based on my book, The House of Mirrors, Justin Trudeau's Foreign Policy, but the pandemic kind of made it so I was not able to come to Hamilton and other places to tour that book. But basically, unfortunately, Justin Trudeau has more or less continued the policy of Stephen Harper. And we see this in many different ways. Just a few days ago in Toronto, there was the big Prospectors and Developers Association of Canada convention, 130 countries represented, and you had 4 ministers of the Trudeau government there on behalf of the mining companies, working to advance the interests of Canadian mining companies. And as people in this room probably know, Canadian mining companies are involved in all kinds of abuses abroad. Basically, you pick any country in the global south, and there's an example of a Canadian mining company that has spurred violence, destroyed ecosystem, etc. And the Canadian government, the Trudeau government, has continued this policy of backing the mining industry, Canada's global mining behemoth, even though they promised before being elected to bring in an ombudsperson that would end public support for Canadian mining companies found to be engaged in major abuses abroad. They then re-promised that early in their mandate, and then when the mining industry started lobbying hard, they came forward with an ombudsperson that has basically no teeth to hold companies responsible, should I say, end public support for companies found responsible for abuses abroad. Export Development Canada support, diplomatic support, etc. So really the Trudeau government has continued on this path with backing the Canadian mining industry, huge amount, more than $100 million in aid to different mining projects abroad that advance Canadian mining interests. Export Development Canada, Trade Commissioner Service support, diplomatic support. Probably the most egregious example is in Tanzania in 2017. Big conflict in Tanzania over unpaid royalties and basically tax evasion by Barrick Gold in Tanzania. Huge controversy, made top news item in Tanzania for a long period of time. And the Canadian High Commissioner in Tanzania organizes a meeting by the head of Barrick and the president of Tanzania. And this is in the country, not only is it huge billions of dollars that the Tanzanian government is accusing Barrick of not having paid, but the Tanzania, the North Mara mine, Barrick Gold's North Mara mine, more than 65 people have been killed since the mid-2000s by Barrick financed police forces. Usually it's people who are trying to get small bits of gold. They go searching for gold dust. They consider it their land, right? They consider the mine has displaced them. And Barrick's security forces have killed dozens. This is reported on by the business press and the Globe and Mail. There's even numbers that say as high as 300 people killed. Nonetheless, huge human rights violations, probably the worst human rights violations of any specific Canadian mine. And after this meeting, organized by the Canadian High Commissioner, and with the Canadian High Commissioner between the President of Tanzania and the head of Barrick, Ian Miles, Canadian High Commissioner, comes out and says, Canada is very proud that it expects all its companies to respect the highest standards, fairness, and respect for laws and corporate social responsibility. We know that Barrick is very much committed to those values. So, the worst Canadian mining company probably there is in the world, Barrick Gold, in the country where they've engaged in the worst abuses, and the full stamp of approval of, this upholds Canadian standards of corporate social responsibility. So if you're going to defend Barrick in Tanzania, you're going to defend basically any Canadian mining company operating in almost any context, and that's what the evidence shows in many different countries, that the Canadian diplomatic apparatus works to advance Canadian mining interests. And we see this, like I said last week in Toronto, with the Prospectors and Developers Association of Canada convention, where the Canadian, the Trudeau government sends 4 different ministers, tons of government officials to promote that. At the Prospectors and Developers Association of Canada meeting, there was a Peru Day. So Canada's ambassador in Lima comes to the Peru Day. Also, the Prime Minister of Peru meets with Canada's Trade Minister on the, at the convention. And this is another example of Canada's backing for the ouster of the elected left-wing president 3 months ago, right? Pedro Castillo was elected, just seems to, he was in office for 1.5 years, undoubtedly troubles within his mandate, but he was elected. He was elected to redress the flagrant inequity, primarily around Indigenous people being excluded for centuries. And the Canadian government, since Castillo was ousted, immediately at the Organization of American States basically said this was a step forward for democracy. The ouster of elected president was a step forward for democracy. And since that time, I think it's now up to 7, well, I guess the ministers meeting the Prime Minister would be 8. The Canadian ambassador has met with 7 different ministers of the replacement government. Met with the replacement president, Dina Boluarte, and then multiple other ministers, mining minister, trade minister, etc. That's very irregular in Canadian diplomacy, right? This is about Canada shoring up, diplomatically shoring up, a government that is not legitimate, that has killed more than 60, primarily Indigenous, protesters who were opposing the ouster of a government that a president they elected, and they felt was part of a process of trying to redress the flagrant racism and inequity within Peru. So this is a clear Canadian backing for the U.S. government, of course, is also supporting the ouster of Castillo and propping up Boluarte. You saw a similar dynamic in Bolivia in late 2019, where the Canadian government backed the ouster of Evo Morales, the military stepping in and pushing him out. Chrystia Freeland, after Morales was expelled from the country by the military, she put out a statement saying, quote, "Canada stands with Bolivia and the democratic will of its people. We note the resignation of President Morales and will continue to support Bolivia during this transition and the new elections." And then Trudeau, when he met with the Chilean president, criticized the election irregularities in Bolivia. Well, it was all a scam. There weren't election irregularities. In fact, Canada, through the Organization of American States, played an important role in the OAS's effort to discredit these elections, and now there's been multiple academic studies, and even the New York Times has admitted that this was all, the claims of election irregularities was all basically a way to justify the right-wing protests that then led to the process of pushing Morales out. And Canada really backed the Áñez regime for a year as it tried to postpone having elections in Bolivia. And finally, when elections were held, which were forced by the popular movement, when elections were held, Morales' party won by a very large margin. Elsewhere in this hemisphere, of course, one of the reasons why the Trudeau government didn't like Pedro Castillo in Chile was because his first foreign minister said that the Lima Group was the most disastrous thing that Peru had ever done in its foreign policy. Now, the Lima Group was a Canadian-instigated initiative to try to overthrow the Venezuelan government. And it's called the Lima Group because the PR, it sounds a bit better to call it the Lima Group than the Ottawa Group, right? Sort of North American, and in fact, it's a little bit better PR. Ottawa Group's a bit better than the Washington Group, which was in fact what was going on, which is that Chrystia Freeland took on this task of building a coalition in the hemisphere to try to oust Venezuela's government, and they worked principally with the Peruvian government, and that's why they got it labeled the Lima Group. The Trudeau government backed I'm not going to get into the Venezuela coup effort. Fortunately, it's failed. It's actually quite a blow to Trudeau's foreign policy, but included recognizing, of course, Juan Guaido. Canada played a big role in that whole process, bringing Venezuela to the International Criminal Court, funding opposition groups, sanctions, 4 rounds of sanctions. So it's a really brazen effort to oust the legitimate president of Venezuela. And again, fortunately, it has failed, but it certainly should be remembered by Canadians in terms of understanding the Trudeau government's foreign policy and our foreign policy more generally. Elsewhere in the hemisphere, you have their policy towards Haiti, and I'm not going to get into it in extensive detail. If people want to talk about it in the question period, we can get into it. It's a bit complicated, but the most important part for us to recognize is the Trudeau government has basically continued this 2-decade-long policy that Canada's had in a very clear way since 2003 and planning the ouster of the elected government in 2004 of extreme imperialism in Haiti. And the most egregious example of that was that when Jovenel Moïse was assassinated, the president, about 20 months ago now, afterwards there was a power struggle between 3 different political figures in Haiti over who should lead the country. And the head of the Senate, the person who was then the prime minister, and the person that Jovenel Moïse had just announced, but was never recognized by Parliament or Ariel Henry to lead. And basically, how it was decided Ariel Henry would lead was the core group, which is basically the U.S. and Canada and a number of other countries' foreign ambassadors, put out a tweet and said, "That's the leader of Haiti." I mean, I say this literally, and this is not figuratively. It was literally, there's a power struggle. They put out the tweet. Within 24 hours, the political structure in Haiti says, okay, it's the one that the Canadians and the U.S. want is going to lead. And that person has now been leading for 20 months. And so Canada's part of this coalition called the Core Group of foreign ambassadors that has incredible influence within Haitian affairs. The vast majority of Canadians never even heard of it. Everyone in Haiti knows what the Core Group is. And it's just a reflection of Canadian imperial power in Haiti. And now, of course, in recent months, there's been a big campaign for Canada to lead a military mission to Haiti. We can get into that in more detail. But basically, Canada has played a central role in overseeing the descent of Haiti. And the main way, basically, we opposed the political forces that represent the majority poor, who are trying to figure things out for the country. We ousted the government, thousands of officials back in 2004. We tried variation of that again in 2010. And we've propped up the most regressive elements of Haitian political society, drug runners, murderers, former Duvalier people. And that's what Jovenel Moïse was. That's the president was assassinated. He represented that, and Trudeau backed Jovenel Moïse throughout mass protests in 2018, different phases of those mass protests. But and so we've propped up the most regressive elements of Haitian society against the wishes of the vast majority of people. And lo and behold, those regressive forces have led to this real spiraling out of control, where now we're in a situation of insecurity, and particularly in Port-au-Prince, that's not even good for capitalists, right? The capitalists now, it's not even good for the Canadian sweatshop interests that want low wages in Haiti. But Trudeau government has continued that policy, and very consciously. Shifting gears to the Middle East, we of course have this Trudeau government that loves the apartheid regime, basically no criticism, voted against more than 60 resolutions at the United Nations, upholding Palestinian rights, a government that has, when there's an effort to bring Israel to the International Criminal Court, sends a letter saying, don't bring Israel to the International Criminal Court. In fact, we might not give you, we fund you, we're one of the bigger funders, we might not fund you if you actually investigate Israeli crimes. We have a government that just recently, they adopted the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's anti-Palestinian definition of anti-Semitism, and just recently, Heritage Canada has made it so those getting contracts are going to have to agree to the government's anti-racism strategy, which includes the IHRA definition. And so meaning that, I don't know, I haven't seen any real analysis, but probably tens, maybe even hundreds of thousands of people will have to sign on to something saying they agree to this, and so basically that greatly restricts their ability to criticize Israel. Of course, they appointed a special envoy to protect Israel from criticism, a man by the name of Erwin Kotler, who has a more than 4-decade-long history of basically labeling criticism of Israel or Zionism as anti-Semitism. They sued. So the Canadian public won't know the proper label on wines that are produced in settlements in the West Bank. They actually sued, so we can't know that these are wines being produced in illegal Israeli settlements. We had the Canadian ambassador, Deborah Lyons, back in early 2020, who organized a pizza party for Canadians fighting in the Israeli military. So the Canadian ambassador organized a pizza party for Canadians fighting in any other country's military. That would just be weird to have the Canadian diplomatic outpost. And then, of course, she talked about how proud Canada was for these Canadians fighting for the occupation, Israel occupation forces. Chrystia Freeland, back in late 2018, when she was in Israel when they were campaigning for the seat on the United Nations Security Council, which fortunately Canada did not win. She said at a forum that if Canada won a seat on the Security Council, it would act as an asset for Israel, right? So our getting a seat on the Security Council was to advance Israel's interests, saying this openly. So they've really continued this anti-Palestinian policy that this didn't just start with Harper. I mean, Harper deepened and worsened a problem that existed, and I've detailed that in my Canada and Israel book. But Trudeau government has really continued decidedly anti-Palestinian policies. Elsewhere, of course, everyone knows about the massive sale of light armored vehicles to the Saudi monarchy. There was just a report in the Breach where they justify, Canadian government internal documents, how they justify those arms sales around the geopolitical considerations, and Saudi Arabia is a bulwark in the region for Western interests. Canada has been, the Trudeau government has pushed arms sales, not just with regard to Saudi Arabia, pushed arms sales in the region. So people often think about when there's Canadian weapons are sold to another country, that's like a private endeavor between a private Canadian company and another country. But in fact, if you look, the Canadian government is working aggressively to promote those arms sales, right? It's not just giving the permits, which they did with Saudi Arabia, but it's also the Canadian Commercial Corporation, that Crown Corporation, that usually actually oversees the deal, right? It's actually a deal between the Canadian Commercial Corporation and the other country's government. But the Trudeau government has pushed Canadian arms interests at the International Defence Exhibition Conference in Abu Dhabi. There was actually just the pandemic shut them down for a couple of years, but just recently they held the most recent one. And they send trade commissioners, they send Department of National Defense employees, Global Affairs Canada employees, to basically drum up support for Canadian weapons makers in the region. It's not just the light armored vehicles, it's sniper rifles, it's all kinds of different Canadian weapons sales to the region. The Canadian Trudeau government, while rhetorically they say they support the abolition of nuclear weapons, they've said variations of that many times, or a number of times, in practice they have worked against things like the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, right? So they voted against holding the conference that negotiated the TPNW. Then when it was negotiated, they voted against it, and now they've just actually last time, back in November, they voted against another UN resolution to uphold the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So they're hostile to efforts to rid the world of these disastrous weapons. And part of the reason they're hostile to that is because they are big proponents of NATO, and NATO is a nuclear-armed club. So back in 2019, our dear leader, Justin, on the 70th anniversary of NATO's founding, he said, quote, "For 70 years, NATO has been fundamental to Canada's security and defense. In recent years, Canada has strengthened its engagement in NATO, taking on vital leadership roles. Today, Canada is leading NATO missions in Latvia, Iraq, and NATO maritime forces in the Mediterranean Sea and the Black Sea." So that was back in 2019. Boisterous support for this alliance that has, of course, waged war in Libya, Afghanistan, former Yugoslavia. And that policy has only heightened over the past year. The Russian invasion of Ukraine, which I consider illegal and brutal, has just heightened the sort of pro-NATO kind of policy. Now, while I disagree with what Russia, and I think it's quite immoral what Russia's doing in Ukraine, I think it's absolutely essential that we understand that this is not unprovoked war, despite all the rhetoric in our media. In fact, when Melanie Joly went to Kyiv in mid-January, while Russian forces were already on the border and basically Putin was calling for negotiations or we will invade, which now at that point was already been going on for 6 weeks of growing kind of tensions. When Melanie Joly goes to Kyiv and says, yes, we want Ukraine to join NATO, she knew exactly what that would lead to, which was it increases the likelihood of the violence that we have unfortunately seen a whole lot of. Canada's Operation Unifier, Canada's training mission in Ukraine, that was part about bringing Ukraine into NATO, right? Explicitly so. Many of the officials making Ukrainian forces more interoperable, more attuned to the NATO war doctrine. So Canada had been working since 2015 to sort of make Ukraine a de facto member of NATO, and the Trudeau government, that began during Harper, the Trudeau government continued and in fact extended that. One of the things they did in Operation Unifier, Harper had restricted Canadian forces to being only in the west of Ukraine. Trudeau opened that up so they could get closer to the front line. Of course, Ukrainian forces were fighting a war against part of Ukrainian population dating back to 2014 in the Donbass. And the Trudeau government actually loosened the restrictions that Harper had put on that question. And part of the Operation Unifier, part of the way to understand Operation Unifier is that it put Canada, it began in April of 2015, and it put Canada basically in a situation of a proxy war with Russia. Because you had, on one side, Canada training, obviously the Americans and the UK training as well, and providing some weapons, to a Ukrainian force, government force, that was fighting in the east of its country against people, other Ukrainians, Eastern Ukrainians, who were getting a certain amount of support from Russia. And it's exaggerated in our media, but we're getting some degree of support from Russia. And so you basically had this like low-level conflict, proxy war going on for 7 years, and then Moscow massively expanded that on February 24th of last year. So one of the ways to look at this war is in through that lens of what was a low-level proxy war massively escalated. And Canada has, alongside the Russian escalation, has itself, of course, constantly escalated its involvement. And I think that we have to recognize that while we're not formally at war with Russia, we are effectively at war with Russia, right? We have multiple media reports about Canadian Special Forces on the ground. Of course, former Canadian troops who were, in the initial days at least, openly encouraged by the Canadian government to go and join the fight. We have huge amounts of intelligence support that Canada is providing to the Ukrainians. That's a really under-discussed contribution, and the intelligence support is primarily from the U.S., but that's a really important part of why the Ukrainian military has had the success that it's had. We have, of course, huge amounts of weaponry, right, that Canada has provided to Ukraine. Le Devoir, on the one-year anniversary of the Russian invasion, Le Devoir said they looked at 17 different announcements and they worked out $2.26 billion in weapons that Canada had already provided. And since that, there's been, I think, 4 more tanks, quite a significant increase since then, certainly into the hundreds of millions of dollars more. So this is a really significant massive Canadian contribution. And I believe, like I said, I believe Canada is de facto at war with Russia. Melanie Joly on Friday, Foreign Minister Joly, she said explicitly that the goal is regime change. Right? She repeated it twice in the press conference. The goal is regime change in Moscow. And the day before that, Defense Minister Anita Anand announced that Canada was fast-tracking the purchase of anti-tank, anti-aircraft, and anti-drone weapons for Canadian troops on the Russian border in Latvia, right? And it's using a measure that it hadn't used since the war in Afghanistan. So really, I don't know the total of the cost, but hundreds of millions of dollars in new weaponry for the Canadian forces based in Latvia. And of course, since 2017, one of the things the Trudeau government did in its really aggressive NATO posture is it took command of a battle group on Russia's border, right? So the promise was we won't expand NATO 1 inch eastward. That was the promise go back 30 years, and they've of course expanded many countries. But now, in 2017, we have Canadian troops quasi-permanently stationed on Russia's border, and now on Thursday we have this. We have to use our war measure around weapons procurement to get the top kit to our troops that are right on Russia's border. So we see where this is going. It's not a good place, and definitely we need to be pushing hard for a de-escalation, negotiation process, and certainly away from just adding fuel to the fire. As one of the reasons that we need to understand how Canada's contributed to provoking the Russian invasion, one of the reasons is to understand is that it's not just relevant in terms of understanding going forward with regards to Ukraine, right? If you understand that Canada has been pushing provocative policies with regards to Ukraine vis-a-vis Russia for at least since 2014, at least since Canada helped oust the elected Yanukovych government, at least since that point, but in fact before that, but in a very clear way since 2014, well, I think you come to different conclusions on how to go forward, right? So if you just think Canada's just been out, not part of this, Russia just invaded one night, one night Putin thought that, we gotta just take Ukraine, and this is supposed to be part of Russia, and there's sort of no security considerations that Russia has, or there's sort of no broader geopolitical dynamics going on, then it's not necessarily incoherent to say, hey, we should send more weapons to defend the Ukraine against this aggressive invader, right? There's a certain coherence. Now, if you know that Canada helped provoke it, then you might come to more to the conclusion of let's try to de-escalate, let's try to go away from this path that we've just been pushing forward here for at least a decade. Now, that's important for understanding Ukraine, but I think it's also important for trying to alleviate and try to not get ourselves into another disastrous type situation, which is vis-a-vis Taiwan, right? The American government is clearly pushing to use Taiwan as a way to provoke a war with China, right? The American government sees China as a threat to its dominance in the world, which it's not seeing that incorrectly. China is economically become much more powerful, much more significant, and the American government wants to avoid China increasingly becoming the main power in its region. Right now it's the U.S. Increasingly economically, China is a dominant economic force in its region, but the U.S. wants to maintain its hegemony of the region and, of course, of the world. And the Trudeau government is increasingly joining in this strategy of contain China, right? And they released a Indo-Pacific strategy 2 or 3 months ago, where it said explicitly, it referred to China as, quote, an increasingly disruptive global power, engaged in, quote, foreign interference and increasingly coercive treatment of other countries. And then, as part of the solution to this increasingly disruptive global power, the Canadian government announced $500 million in new military and spying initiatives for the region, and said, quote, Canada will augment its naval presence, including by increasing the number of frigates deployed to the region, where it will conduct forward naval presence operations. So Canada will send more naval vessels to the South China Sea alongside American, sometimes British, sometimes French, that run provocative maneuvers. And that's been going on now for multiple years. It gets some attention in the media every so often. That's happening alongside the Canadian spy planes going up close to Chinese airspace and spying. There's been a number of stories when they always accuse whenever a Chinese jet intercepts the spy plane, they always accuse China of being aggressive. But if you look at the map, of course, it's not off of Canada's coastal, not off near Canada's airspace, but of course near China's airspace. So they've increasingly joined this at the military level, supporting the U.S. empire's bid to encircle China, new policy around more American bases in the Philippines. You got towards 100,000, I think it is, U.S. troops in the region, Japan, South Korea, etc. And so Trudeau is increasingly going on, and we're going through this period of just this incredible sort of like xenophobia in our media of the Chinese. I mean, if you read the Global Mail or the National Post, or even Global Mail for that matter, Trudeau is an agent of the Chinese Communist Party. I mean, they almost come out and almost are saying that. It's just stuff that's just so diluted that it's hard to get your head around. The Trudeau government has conceded to this. Obviously we have this recent decision around the Canadian academics who who collaborate with Chinese researchers who have ties to the Chinese military. And I'm all for demilitarizing university campuses, but Canadian universities announce contracts for the U.S. military, right? For Canadian researchers, right? Like, we're not talking about, like, are there Canadian researchers who have ties to U.S. researchers that are working with the U.S. military. We're talking about literally go on Dalhousie's website and they're like, literally, hey, we've got American military representatives coming, come get some of this U.S. military contract funding. So the double standards here can be pretty stark. Obviously, you have the arrest of Meng Wanzhou. You have the free trade agreement that we signed with the U.S. and Mexico that had this sort of no China clause that was put in it. So the Trudeau government has increasingly gone along with this this anti-China policy, which, like I said, again, I think the American government is clearly, or major segments of the American government are pushing. They see what happened in Ukraine as actually a good thing, right? We provoked Russia into a war, getting involved in a disastrous war, and we might want to do the same thing vis-a-vis Taiwan as a way to weaken China. Now, the Trudeau government's policy on China, I think, is somewhat unique, somewhat different than some of these other issues that I've talked about, in that there is division. There is a division, and this goes to the heart of, like, understanding Canadian foreign policy. And the division here is between a important segment of Canadian capitalists, Canadian capital, that wants to just have basic trade and investment relations with China, right? They see a big market, we can make lots of money, this is, make profits, etc. And they don't want this growing tensions, or at least want the tensions to be, sort of contained. Versus another segment of Canadian Canadian foreign policy establishment, which is the security apparatus, the military-industrial complex, and the U.S. empire, who want, let's go for it. This is what we want. We want to push ourselves towards this war to contain China. And so that's my reading of the history of Canadian foreign policy. It's not necessarily an uplifting reading, but it's that there's basically two forces driving Canadian foreign policy. Support for empire, historically British, today American, and support for Canadian corporate interests. On China, what we see is somewhat of a clash between those two different interests playing out right now. Unfortunately, the opinions of the people, people in this room, and the population, doesn't really affect policy that much. Unfortunately, that's the history. And there's a few examples, outlier examples that I can get into on the popular opinion and democracy, if you want to call it that, affecting policy. The rhetoric about international rules-based order, feminist foreign policy, it's just rhetoric, right? And you can, by looking at any sort of serious analysis, you can show very easily how they don't take it seriously. So that's the reality. This didn't begin with Justin Trudeau in terms of Canadian foreign policy being about empire and corporate interests, but they have clearly upheld that, advanced that, and so what do, right? Well, the first thing you do is you figure out what they're doing. That's always the first step. And the second thing you do is you take action. What that action is. I mean, we've got an example. The Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War is, one of those forms of action. We have all kinds of groups challenging on Canada's policy in Haiti, Solidarité Québec Haïti. You have the Mining and Justice Network that organized protests against the Prospectors and Developers Association in Canada conference last week. You have obviously the Palestine. Palestine, you have many groups. CJPME, IJV, SPHR, organizing. Just Peace Advocates. So you have those types of groups. Now, what should we be calling for? What should we be doing? I'm very much a less bad right? I don't believe we're going to get a just Canadian foreign policy anytime soon. I think we're in a position of trying to make this foreign policy less damaging to the world. There are many demands, from the politically simple demands, like the ombudsperson on the mining, right? This was something the Trudeau government had committed to, right? And then basically totally watered down and made it a PR exercise. It's not that difficult to have an ombudsperson that has at least some degree of teeth to hold abusive mining companies accountable. On something like on like Iran. Trudeau government came into office calling for restarting diplomatic relations with Iran. It's a very easy thing to do. We can do that, tomorrow. On Palestine, stop voting against UN resolution. I mean, it's just like you tick that box, you tick that, right? There's tons of making Canadian foreign policy slightly less bad. There's also the bigger issues of pulling out of NATO, things that are way outside of the bounds of the current political discussion that I think we should have on the agenda. But the basics of it all are not that it's technically difficult to have a better Canadian foreign policy, but that it's politically difficult, and that's where we come in, which is we need to mobilize, we need to organize, and we need to demand a more just Canadian foreign policy. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks, Yves. That was great. What a time we live in where you have to go to Yves Engler to find out what's going on, not so much the corporate media. Wouldn't it be great if Yves Engler was the columnist, all of the columnists at the Globe and Mail? I think that would be great. He could do sports too. And we'll be thanking him. A lot to say about that shortly. And before we do, I should just mention, of course, if you like this event, there is going to be an event this Saturday at noon. It's an online event. It's Dimitri Lascaris, another prominent Canadian foreign policy speaker, and he's going to be looking at or talking about why he's decided to go to Russia. He's decided to go there and see things from the eyes of our so-called enemies. So that's going to be a free event, of course, and it's going to have simultaneous translation into French. So if you go to the website for the Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War at hcsw.ca, you can register and everything, and it'll be happening 12 o'clock noon Hamilton time. But yes, to thank Yves and talk about other issues, we have Ken, so why don't you find you there.
Hi, everyone. Yves Engler wrote the book The Ugly Canadian to criticize Stephen Harper's foreign policy, but we are not here tonight to demonize Canadian politicians, whether they're Harper or Trudeau. The sad fact is that most Canadian prime ministers are mere vassals of whomever is in office in the White House in the USA. And the fact is that in book after book, article after article, lecture after lecture, Yves has pointed out that successive Canadian governments have been the willing little helpers of the formerly our British imperial masters and today our US imperial masters. Whether it's to arrest Meng Wanzhou or to send tanks to Ukraine. Clearly what Canada needs now is to quit NATO, develop an independent foreign policy. It's not an outlandish idea because it's something akin to the foreign policy of our closest trading partner in the USMCA, namely Mexico. We could try and emulate Mexico. What I especially liked about Yves' talk tonight is the denunciation of everything Chinese emanating out of Ottawa. The campaign of selective and uncorroborated leaks from the secret police, namely CSIS, to anti-Chinese ideologues in the Globe and Mail is what Noam Chomsky termed, quote, manufacturing consent among the people of Canada for the coming U.S. war on China over Taiwan. We need to be clear about that. The other thing we need to be clear about, brothers and sisters, is that's going to have a terrible, terrible effect on Chinese Canadians. It's going to mean that Chinese Canadians' careers are ruined. It's going to mean that Chinese Canadians are going to be excluded from the political process. They're going to be marginalized the way they were in the days of the head tax, the infamous head tax that Canada imposed. And it means that there are going to be a huge spike in racist attacks on people of Asian origin in Canada and hate crimes as well. Remember, after Donald Trump called the COVID-19 pandemic the Wuhan flu, in BC alone, in 1 year, the number of hate crimes and racist attacks against people of Asian origin spiked 300%. So this is a serious business that's happening in Ottawa, and we should be on guard and opposing it every inch of the way, and I'm glad that Yves brought that up. The best thing about Yves Engler, in my opinion, is the fact that he does original primary research of his own on a whole spectrum of foreign policy issues, which he covered today, from Canada, from Ukraine to Taiwan to Haiti to Peru and to Palestine. He is the go-to person on these subjects and many more. But he is also a political activist who can be counted upon to attend political rallies to demand that Canada keep its hands off Haiti or Ukraine. He even regularly disrupts cabinet ministers in public. You probably saw him disrupt Minister Saint-Onge 2 days ago. How many hits did you get?
Got 1.2 million on that.
Yves is a guy who not only talks the talk, and very well, but he also walks the walk. Please join me in giving a big round of applause to Yves. As the treasurer of the coalition, I would be remiss if I didn't say something about fundraising. So at the back, you can see our red hat, the giant red hat. It's on the back table. I'm going to leave it there because we don't want to compete with your money that should go first to buying Yves' books, which are in the back corner there. But if you have any left over, just throw it in the hat. And if you don't have any with you tonight, you can always make an e-transfer to the coalition or go to our website and go to the donate menu. So thanks again for coming tonight, and I guess we're going to go on to the Q&A.
Yeah. Yeah, so we have a question and answer session that's quite voluminous. I know there might be lots of people that want more detail about what he said or want to disagree or whatever, and that's fine. Again, this is a space for discussion and inclusion, and Doug is also present. Make sure everyone's viewpoints get heard. And so what I think I'm going to do is, it's going to be simple. Since we're in a small room, you can raise your hand and I'll just point to you to indicate you can ask a question. We just would ask that you limit your remarks or questions to 2 minutes, please, because we may have many questions possibly, and so we have to make sure people have time to get their questions in. We'll give a 30-second warning, I guess, if the questions go on too long. You can make short statements. We don't want to do back and forth between questions and Yves because that will take up time from other people that have questions. We'll come back to you if there's time. And so, of course, this is a respectful discussion, and we don't want to denigrate anyone for who they are or their viewpoints, and we want to look towards finding solutions and talking about all these interesting things. So we'll have an open discussion until about 7 o'clock or so, I think. I see David's raising his hand already.
I'm concerned about NDP criticism of the Liberals. They don't seem to criticize. Now they're in coalition with them. The domestic issues, much less foreign policy. What's happening with the NDP? Comment on that?
Well, I wrote a piece 2 weeks ago or something like that that basically said, would the world be better off if the NDP didn't have a foreign affairs critic? Because on domestic issues, it's, they might not be criticizing as much as we would want. They usually don't come from the more pro-corporate, more, anti-worker, anti-environment, anti-feminist, racist perspective, right? They usually don't come from that. But on foreign policy, Heather McPherson regularly says, hey, you're not being belligerent enough to China, Russia, Iran, Nicaragua. It's actually remarkable how much Heather McPherson, NDP foreign critic, is her policy is just basically what the U.S. empire will do. It's pretty stark. The only issues where I would say there's like fairly clearly that's not the case. That obviously on the Saudi arms deal, there's an issue they'll come up pretty good on. On Palestine, the NDP has now become, I'm not saying they anywhere where they should be, but they are. It's clearly it's better to have an NDP foreign critic vis-a-vis the question of Palestine than not, because they are challenging the government somewhat, McPherson specifically. But in general, and this isn't, McPherson was pushing for NATO, Ukraine joining NATO since before Russia's, before February 24th of last year, right? This didn't just start. They all try to frame it like that. So it's pretty remarkable, and I would even go further. Like even on an issue like the like mining ombudsperson, which is should be an easy NDP, very little. Don't even raise it, right? Just dropped it. And I wonder McPherson just did a tour of Europe. It was basically like a NATO tour. Go to Sweden, like put in NATO, then she went to Kyiv, and like did the full, And I get the impression that there's an interview she did with Jeremy Appel and this other Alberta-based left-wing journalist. It's like long, like 40-minute interviews, mostly not about international affairs, mostly just she's an Edmonton politician and stuff. And but in it, she kind of she basically admits that we're in this geopolitical context where she doesn't say we have to follow the U.S. empire. It doesn't say that, but that's what she's actually saying. That there's this sort of unique geopolitical context that necessitates sort of boldness and aggressiveness. Which, well, where did this geopolitical context come from, right? Like, who's created this we need to contain China kind of dynamic. So I think a combination of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the U.S. pushing on China has really got her specifically, and the party more generally, find me dissent from Matthew Green, Leah Gassan, or Nikki Ashton on Ukraine, right? Find me a tweet. Nothing. Just completely go on. And they, to whatever degree, I don't know, but I don't know them personally, but I have enough sense of their politics, that they understand this isn't quite as black and white as we're, being told. I don't know. My impression is that Leah Gassan probably actually understands a bit further on that. She's not, happy with Canadian policy. But they're just staying completely silent. And you have people like Charlie Angus. McPherson, she's been repeatedly said no negotiations, right? Just taking this hard line, no negotiations kind of position, which is you can say we should keep sending weapons, we should keep doing intelligence support, do all this stuff, but have negotiations, right? What's the downside? But they're in such that sort of kind of hawkish, escalate war type thinking that's where the NDP's at.
Well, I think Ruth actually was next. Sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
I read that 3,000 people in Italy are protesting the war. Where are, besides Ken, Coalition to Stop the War, where are we?
Yeah,
in Canada. Where do we march? Can we not come together as a country to protest what's happening or to change what's happening?
Yeah, well, I think there were pretty significant protests in Germany as well during the Munich conference. There's some, there's I think there's been some in. I think the German one's actually been more consistent in a whole series of them in Germany. There was the one in Washington D.C. that got lots of heat from the left because there was right-wing forces, anti-war right-wing forces that were part of it. we had 150, I'd say, in Montreal on the 1-year anniversary of the Russian invasion. So it was a little bit of a rally. I know there was actions I don't know what happened here, but there was actions in other cities. There was a couple dozen in different places. But no, yeah, there's not much street action. There's not much popular education. There's not many like forums. There's not like events happening on these questions. So yeah, there's the mobilizatory kind of dynamic on this is very very low.
And India won't tell anyone, right? They bought their government, so there's no way of getting that out anyways.
Yeah, and that's a whole issue too. Let's see, there's a lot of questions. RF, you were about to go in, Ruth.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank Ken, who invited me to this nice event. And I'd like also to thank you for your good presentation about the Canadian foreign policy in terms of economy and politics. My question is that almost all what you presented, I think that it is well known by many people. But my question is that why Canada is taking this position? This is one. And to the best of my knowledge, that all over the world, I haven't seen any country, people who hate Canada. Therefore, I don't think it is not clear to me why Canada takes this position and not taking the position that all people love Canada and all the country respects Canada. All countries all over the world respect Canada. So why Canada doesn't put itself in the middle, neutral? This is one. And the second question is that you are talking about the government of Trudeau. Do you think that, suppose that other person, other than Trudeau, he or she is free to take a free decision about Canada in terms of the political policy? Is other, for example, the other coalition in Canada is free, or it is a decision of the allied countries that Canada maybe it is free in taking a decision about certain a gold mine in Africa, but in terms of the political relationship, geopolitical policy, do you think that Canada is free to take its own decision that these support the Canadian people?
Yeah, there's a lot there. There's a lot that, I mean, I could see a situation in like 3 or 4 years from now where we'd have to come back here and have an event called the Ugly Canadian, Jagmeet Singh's foreign policy. Unfortunately, I could see that's not an unlikely, well, it's probably unlikely he's going to win, but if he did win, that would be, yeah, it's structural rather than individual, right? It's not about Harper, not about Justin, not about, right? And so what's the structural? Then we get down to what is the structural, okay? And there's a structural and like what, I have a whole book on the propaganda side to the structural, right? So that's one whole discussion too. And then the more, institutional. So we have a country that's born of the British Empire, that's a European settler colonial state, that it has close relations to the main empire through the late 1800s, early 1900s, as it's conquering Nigeria, as it's conquering Afghanistan, as it's, spreading itself all around the world. And there's Canadians that are fighting and being the colonial governor of different African countries. 3 different Canadians were colonial governors of African countries. So Canada has this unique relationship to the 2 main empires of the past 2 centuries. A unique relationship to the British Empire, and then obviously since World War II, U.S. Empire. And Canadian capitalist class has done well by that, right? Canadian capital, Canada is one of the richest countries in the world, and it's at the top of the pecking order in a very hierarchical world economy. And you have white supremacy, right? You have, if you see with like the Five Eyes, when we talk about the Five Eyes, we got to get tough on China because of the Five Eyes. Well, what is the Five Eyes? The Five Eyes is Britain, the U.S., UK, Australia, and New Zealand. Well, what is that? What is it? Well, there's many more English speakers in Nigeria. There's many more English speakers in India. geographically, well, what does UK or what does New Zealand and Australia really have this to do? Well, what connects it, right? Well, connects it is a certain relationship to British Empire, to white supremacy, to European settler colonialism.
So it is not a matter of the who is on the top of the government, Trudeau or another person. It is the structure.
It's structure, and there are many facets to that structure that like you have to ultimately get into, and each issue you have to get into. Like clearly on China, there is a aggressive campaign coming from Washington to push Canada into joining. That's absolutely clear. This is not primarily emanating from like some Canadian self-interest calculation, right? There are important Canadian institutions that see it in their self-interest. The Canadian military, right? Well, but what the Canadian military and the security apparatus clearly see it in their self-interest to get tough on China. Well, what are those two institutions? I mean, the Canadian military is just an appendage of the American military, right? Let's be clear. If the U.S. invaded Canada tomorrow, there would be Canadians helping the U.S. invade Canada. Because the Canadian military is helping the U.S. everywhere. Whenever the U.S. bombs somewhere, the Canadian military is helping in that. That's just too much integration, too much, right? So the Canadian military, which is a very powerful institution, wants to get tough on China in large part because that's what its good buddies that down south want to have happen. Same thing with CSIS, same thing with the Communications Security Establishment. So there's some of those dynamics. Now, when it comes to the abuses all around the world of the Canadian mining companies, it basically has nothing to do with the U.S., right? And the U.S. is saying you have to back these mining companies to go and murder and rape murder and rape indigenous women in Guatemala. They don't. That's not
related to the mine.
It has to do with Canadian corporate self-interest that's making money off this, and this is where we lead. We are the global power in this domain, and we just want to keep making money off of it. That's not. There's an element there's an element of what is traditionally called left nationalist discussion, which kind of says that everything bad Canada does is because the U.S. forces us to do the bad things. But there are the mining being the clearest example where you just can't make that argument, and it's not just mining. So those are some, and then you get into the whole the propaganda side to this, the ideas side, and why the public goes along with this. And like I said, I have a whole book that deals with that. And it's well grounded, right? If you look at the think tanks, if you look at the academic institutions, right? The Monk most important school of global affairs at Canadian University at U of Toronto. Well, who funded that? Who set it all up? And all the conditions that he put on? Peter Monk, the head of Barrick Gold, who was like had a huge personal self-interest in a certain type of foreign policy, and was supports Pinochet in Chile. He's like hard right-wing and then go into all the different think tanks. You go into the most important public relations institution in the country. It's the Canadian military, right? The Canadian military is this massive public relations apparatus. It's like pumping its perspective on the world to the population. So this stuff is well grounded. Now, in your initial part of your question, you had something about elsewhere and how others perceive Canada. That's a kind of interesting question. Like, I think it is correct that there is often a sort of not a negativity towards Canada in many places in the world. Now, I think that's becoming more complicated in recent years. For instance, the losses at the Security Council, Canada failed 2 different bids for a seat on the Security Council, suggests that at least at the level of the diplomatic apparatus of countries around the world, not necessarily sort of more engaged people in international affairs, they voted against Canada when they in a secret vote, right? So they're choosing, to some extent, the sort of somewhat of a moral element in making that decision. So I think that there's sometimes the perception of people elsewhere liking Canada more than is actually based in fact. On the mining sector, there's clearly lots, particularly in Latin America, lots of hostility towards Canada at local community level to the Canadian mines. Just, that's quite clear. But then there's also a side to it all that is that Canada is this wealthy country that speaks the two main colonial languages, so its ability to pump out its perspective on things is actually quite extensive historically. So that also contributes to how people perceive Canada. But so I think the most important part is that yes, this is structural. It's not about what politician, and it's well grounded. It's well founded in ideological, obviously in economic and political and alliances and all this kind of stuff. But also at the ideological level, it's well founded in our institutions that be it from the media to academia to think tanks to NGOs. There's not a lot of space for really honest criticism of Canadian foreign policy.
Thank you.
Thanks, Yves. And I just got to take a quick moment. Based on what Ruth asked about doing something, Yves just pointed out a lot of horrible things that are happening as a result of Canada's foreign policy and the dangerous things we're getting into with Russia and China. So if you do want to do something, we do in the community in Hamilton what we think people are willing to do, what they're interested in doing. So if there's something that you have on your mind, let us know. Talk to one of the organizers after the event. We can set up something, street actions, or whatever it was you might be thinking. There have been some hands raised in the back row. I see Derek, for instance. Go ahead.
Thank you. So I have a question actually as a follow-up to the mining sector in Canada. And what I'm interested to know about is we are seeing more announcements and moves from the Canadian government and our provincial government in Ontario to expand mining in Canada, and particularly having more domestic mining take place in Canada. And I'd really like to know your thoughts as to, say with the Ring of Fire, this unexplored territory far north of Thunder Bay that's being proposed to be developed. An Australian company has stakes in that mine. And the fact that this is done under the proposal that this will make hundreds of billions of dollars for Canada's mining sector. And I'd like to know your thoughts of if Canada moves into this direction, what kind of echoes will that have in the global economy, in Canada's presence? And one other bit of context is we understand that a company like Glencore has a substantial command in Sudbury, Ontario. And I would think that Glencore is a prototypical company of this transnational entity that has this wealth addiction without any sort of allegiance to a people or country.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not, I'm not that knowledgeable of the Ring of Fire and all that. I know it's, it's very controversial, and I'm mostly of the opinion that we should just keep the minerals in the ground, and we've, from an ecological perspective, we've just been, there's now this new argument that to transition away from fossil fuels, we need to massively expand the extractive sectors, which I think overwhelmingly should be rejected. Now, from a big picture geopolitical dynamic, there's a whole push on like rare earths and other minerals that the sort of China has too much control over, is how it's sort of presented in our media, and that the government's putting all kinds of resources into getting domestic sources and working the American military. The American government's actually funding some of that in Canada, and there's a whole kind of push on that front. So there's a important geopolitical dynamic there. I don't know enough about this sector to know how much like even the rare earth stuff. My understanding is yes, China has control over a lot of the rare earth stuff, but they're actually not that rare. It's just there's lots of places where there's rare earths. It just they've sort of developed forward on that, and there's sort of a lot of exaggeration of the geopolitical danger of that, essentially. But I'm not knowledgeable enough to sort of know that. But yeah, so I don't have in terms of like what the geopolitical. I think that there is no doubt is sort of. I mean, this is so much, it's the vast lands to dispossess First Nations from and take the resources. I mean, that's the big picture, and that's been going on for a couple hundred years, on these territories, right? That's the yeah.
Apparently, it might be possible to extend question and answer period by 15 minutes, because it's about to end, but we can extend it. If you'd like that to happen, raise your hand, have a show of hands if you want to extend it, all four. Okay, who's opposed? Okay, we can go to 7:15. We'll get everybody's question. I think this gentleman had been raising it. There's a couple there, so we'll start with you.
Yeah, I don't know, I'm no economist, I don't know what your background is, but I want to understand the relationship between inflation and military spending. I guess it links to the sister's question about mobilization against the war. I get an uneasy feeling that one of the motivations for NDP's support of the war is jobs, to be frank. Good union jobs, as they might call them. So anyways, I think that's kind of a complex question, but the link to the economy.
What you mean specifically with regards to war in Ukraine? Or just more like
well, the war in primarily, but there's a vast increase in military weaponry sales and expansion, preparation for war.
Yeah. I mean, I think that there was a inflationary process that comes out of the pandemic and supply chains, and so that to me seems what there was an inflationary process taking place, and then the war in Ukraine has exacerbated some of that dynamic, which I think is so we've seen that, and obviously in Western European countries with energy, they're much greater inflation than we're seeing in terms of Canadian military spending. I'd be kind of skeptical that the spending on the Canadian military is having that much of an impact on inflation. Now, with regards to the NDP and their policy on some of this stuff, I do think you're right in that like they've been very reticent on the Saudi arms deal. They had been, there was that one, was that the debate in 2015? Yeah, I think, and where I think it's in the French debate, Thomas Mulcair sort of criticizes the Saudi arms deal. And then the Unifor, the union that represents those making the light armored vehicles in London, Ontario, that they get to the NDP through the local Canada whatever, and then there's like a direct backing off on the question of light armored vehicles, like after there's pressure from the union producers. So there is some of that dynamic. I do think that, and that's. I think there's also to go some of that. I think there's a economic nationalist argument. I worked for Unifor. I worked for the Communications Energy Paperworkers Union for a couple of years, and I think there's an economic nationalist argument for conflict with China. I mean, there's a segment of the sort of union movement that's wants industrial policy, and industrial policy, the whole conflict with China has prodded a more sort of industrial policy like that sort of moving away from corporate globalization. So I think that some of the sort of private sector union rhetoric around industrial policy, economic nationalism kind of aligns fairly well with some of the geopolitical competition. So some of that I think does seep into how the NDP would position itself on some of these issues.